also on the Nevada City Council, so I'm very pleased that we get to showcase our beautiful city and thank the governor and Mrs. Pawlenty for visiting today. It's also really exciting to get to highlight small business and also the pharmacist role in healthcare, which are two issues that are important to me, important to the future of the country. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to hand it over to a man who just finished his first session down in Des Moines, doing a good job fighting for...
He announces me and you hear all that static that happened. Well, I have the honor, there's no static here, I have the honor of introducing the next First Lady of the United States, Mary Pawlenty. She happens to be one of 5 daughters. Her parents were a home builder and a homemaker. Am I correct on that? As a matter of fact, the family's so spread out, it actually took almost 2 generations to get them all born in that family. Mary's oldest sister and her husband were expecting their first child at the same time Mary's mom was expecting Mary. So, I mean, they've got the generations covered there. She went to school in Bethel College in Minnesota. Received, my sister went there. Received her political science degree, summa cum laude. I tell you what, it's so out there, I can't even pronounce it. You know, it's with great honors. Then went on to University of Minnesota Law School, graduated there, and while at school met the love of her life, a young man by the name of Tim Pawlenty. After she graduated from school, she went down to Texas, did a little law work down there. 2 H's down there forced her back to Minnesota. 1 was the heat and 2 was her heart. She was in love with Tim, so a year later she marries Tim Pawlenty. Together, do I have the, this is pretty much right, it was Tim you
right on, this is like the best introduction of my life. Keep going. Yeah, no,
so,
this is awesome.
So anyway, she marries Tim and together their life becomes that of civil service. Tim ran for city council in Edina, Minnesota, I believe, and then also for the state house, was elected there, and then also to the governorship of Minnesota. While all of that is happening, his wife Mary is right there the whole time, I'm sure pushing him along and encouraging him. Mary has served as a judge in Minnesota and has done a lot of work as First Lady. One of the things I'm really proud when I read this about Mary is she has worked with veterans so that when the veterans come back from the war or from service, they are treated with dignity and respect and given the honors that they're given, that they need. The Minnesota National Guard gave her the Patrick Henry Award as a result of her efforts for that. Thank you. She has accompanied Tim and loves doing that. I know just a little bit of a campaign that we had last year. I can't imagine what a nationwide campaign would be. Our prayers are with you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to announce and to give you the next First Lady of the United States, Mary Pawlenty.
Well, that was extremely nice. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for coming out on this very, very warm morning. We appreciate it. We'll be brief because obviously you would like to hear mostly from my husband and have an opportunity to ask questions of him. But I want to take a moment to speak to you about him because obviously Tim and I have been married now going on almost 24 years. And while you would imagine that his wife will stand here and tell you that he's a terrific guy and he's wonderful and that I love him and all of that, I do want to tell you that I support him in equal measure with my head. So it's my heart and my head that is supportive of his effort. Tim is a person of amazing character. Obviously someone I have seen him in his good days and his bad days, through good times, and through challenges, and through all forms of circumstances. And his roots go down deep. I describe him as a solid oak. I've watched him not only obviously in our family, but I've watched him through his political career, whether all his years in the legislature or 2 terms as governor. I watched him battle the liberals in Minnesota, and many, many times thought, I cannot imagine how he's going to manage this one as he battled would come. He has stood strong. He has stood strong on conservative principles and has done a remarkable job. I had the privilege when I was serving as First Lady, and it's a great opportunity in addition to helping our military families, and I focused a great measure of energy on our military families. I had the opportunity to travel a bit with Tim on trade missions and also to support our troops in other countries. So we've been to trade missions in China and India and South America and Europe and all over the planet. I mention that primarily because in addition to being governor, sometimes you think a governor is really quite regional in their scope and understanding. Nothing could be further from the truth. My husband has a great clarity of understanding relative to foreign policy issues, and he is well traveled in that regard. As to visiting our troops, I had the opportunity to go to Bosnia and Kosovo, but I couldn't go to Iraq and Afghanistan, but he's been himself to Iraq 5 times, Afghanistan 3 times. This is a man whose political career is extraordinary. He has not just the heart and the mind to do this, but he has the record and the experience to be the next president of the United States. I want to just briefly touch on his family background as well. Some of you may know this if you're acquainted with him or curious enough about him to come today. Perhaps you're familiar with his background, but he's from South St. Paul, Minnesota, which was originally a meatpacking town. And his mom passed away when Tim was 16 years old, and his dad, who was a truck driver for much of his life, shortly thereafter lost his job for a brief period of time. And I mention that because the type of background that Tim has is one of real life. He understands what it means to face loss and challenge and economic challenge. He understands the importance of personal responsibility, how important it is to have a job. He happened to get a job shortly after his mom passed away, and he's having these challenges. He got a job in the produce department of a local grocery store and was able then to work his way through college and work his way through law school. This is a person who understands real life. And I can tell you from the bottom of my heart that while you may not be perfect, and you know, I'm careful about that because when we put ourselves out there and I'm singing his praises, I don't mean to suggest he's completely perfect. You don't have to ask me about his shortcomings, but if you want to, I can tell you. In any event, I cannot tell you from the bottom of my heart all that I know about this person. It is the content of his character, the fact that his compass is set, the fact that he is strong, that he has the record and the experience to do this job. I am absolutely, positively convinced he is the best person to be the next president of the United States. So, without any further ado, and that was much ado, wasn't it, dear? Yeah, my husband, Governor Tim Pawlenty.
Appreciate it. I wish Mary could come on all the campaign trips, but you know we have 2 teenage daughters at home. One of them drives, and they both like boys, and so there needs to be some supervision back at our house. And she comes on some of the trips, but not all. But I'm delighted that she's along on this trip to lend voice to our campaign and what we believe and what we're trying to do for the future of this country. I'm running for president because I love this country, and I've got the skills and the ability and the values and the experience and the ideas to lead it to a better place. And the country's in trouble. We've got a president right now who is inept when it comes to the economy. We have $4 a gallon gas, or nearly so. We have crushing levels of unemployment. We have a federal government that is out of control. And we have a president who thinks every solution is about growing the government rather than growing the private sector and getting businesses started and growing and jobs growing again in this country. And as I travel this country, and you know that jobs is one of the most important issues facing this country, the people who grow businesses and start businesses and provide jobs and the people who need jobs all say the same thing. You got the government making it so difficult, so expensive, so slow, so challenging, so discouraging, so uncertain, that they're basically on strike. They're saying we don't want to participate in growing the economy because we don't have faith and confidence that this president and this administration is leading the country in the right direction. In fact, they're making it worse. And not only is President Obama inept when it comes to the economy, he's doing something else. He's broken all his promises to the country, or most of them. So he stood before Iowa, and he stood before the country, and he made a series of major promises, and he's broken or unfulfilled almost every one of them. Let me give you a few examples. In March of 2009, after he became president, after he knew how bad the economic hole was that we're in, he told the American people that during his first term as president, he would cut the deficit in half. What did he do? He tripled it. He didn't even come close to fulfilling that. He took it 3 times the other way. And then remember in Iowa when he was campaigning as a candidate, including on the eve of the Iowa caucuses, and Iowa gave him that great boost when he won here in Iowa on the Democratic side. But he said, look, when I'm president, I'll do a health care reform, and we need health care reform. The system's broken. But he said, I'll do it with Republicans. He said, I'll focus on cost containment. As a candidate, he was opposed to the individual mandate, and then he went to Washington, D.C. and jammed down our throats one of the worst pieces of legislation in the modern history of the country, an unconstitutional piece of legislation that takes the problem, drags it into Washington, D.C., and makes it another government system. It's the exact wrong direction, and it should be repealed in its entirety. We should start over and do health care reform the right way and more. But we have now a president who I believe has had his chance. He doesn't have an economic plan. All he's got is a campaign plan. You notice almost every one of his major speeches has a huge political component to it. And he's not focused on the good of the country. He's focused on the good of his re-election. And that's not the kind of president that we need, and that's not the kind of president that I'll be. So I want to share with you a few thoughts about what we're conveying across this state and across the country, Mary and me. And one of the points I want to make with you is you have a great position here in the state of Iowa to be the first to launch or slingshot a candidate forward in this process. I know you take that responsibility and opportunity very seriously. And I want to make sure that you also are not just first, but that you're right. You pick the candidate who can actually not just be great in that moment of time in Iowa, but also be somebody who can actually be the nominee, somebody who can actually beat Barack Obama in a general election, and somebody who can be a successful president and occupy the office in some of the most historically challenging times in the history of the country. So a few thoughts in that regard. Number one, I think you want somebody in the Oval Office and the next President of the United States who's actually run something, a large public or enterprise, or at least with a public component to it, managed a large organization, led it to conclusion under difficult circumstances. We've seen what happens when you put somebody in the Oval Office. Barack Obama had never run anything, never really done anything, was a college professor. He was a U.S. Senator long enough to have a cup of coffee before it got cold. And then we put him in the Oval Office and wonder why it's not going well. I mean, that is not a good formula for success going forward. And so we need to make sure that the person we put in there has actually had the opportunity and the responsibility and the experience and the seasoning and the judgment to have run a large organization with a public component to it and driven to conclusion under difficult circumstances. I have. Many of the other candidates in this race on the Republican side have not. Number two, every Republican candidate is going to stand before a group like this and say many or maybe all of the same things. They're going to say, I'm for cutting taxes, I'm for reducing spending, I'm for fixing schools through accountability and reform and parental choice, and I'm for health care reform the right way, not the government way, and I'm for pro-growth economic policies, and I'm pro-life, and I'm pro-traditional marriage, and I'm pro being tough on the terrorists and the like. But when you look at the records of these candidates, you'll see that many of them are just talking about it. Most of them have never actually done it, never accomplished that, never driven those things to results. So when you look at my record in Minnesota, taking Minnesota, one of the most liberal states in the country, in a decisively more conservative direction, taking spending from historic highs to historic lows, cutting taxes net over 8 years during my time as governor, even though we had 2 big recessions during those years. Doing school reform by saying we're not just going to have seniority pay for teachers, we're going to have performance pay for teachers based on results. Doing public employee compensation reform before it was cool and popular. Appointing a majority of the Minnesota Supreme Court as conservative justices who will interpret the law as written and not just make it up on the back of a napkin or insert their personal or political views into the law. And then making sure that we did health care reform the right way. No mandates, no takeovers, but focusing on market forces and consumers in that process. So that is a record of results, and we're in this bus out here that's touring in Iowa under that theme, the record of results, because we've had enough fancy speeches. We've had a president who runs around the country, gives these grand speeches as a candidate, makes all kinds of promises as president, but he doesn't get the job done. And so I think you want somebody who's demonstrated the ability to not just talk, but also get the job done. My record in Minnesota is the best record of any candidate in the race on these issues facing the country. And then lastly, we need to get the country moving again. It starts with telling the American people the truth. So when I announced my campaign in Des Moines, Iowa, we said we're going to look the American people in the eye. We're going to say what the real issues are. We're going to put the real solutions on the table, and we're going to have the courage of our convictions and the strength of leadership to say, American people can handle the truth. They need leaders who will show them a better way forward. That's what we're going to do. And there's some hard truths in that, even for Iowa. So I came here on the day of my announcement, even though I'm a candidate in Iowa, and said, you know, in the context of this terrible budget situation, we're going to have to phase out ethanol subsidies over time. But I made it clear, we're not just picking on ethanol. We're going to have to look at phasing out or eliminating all the subsidies over time, given how deep our budget crisis is, to give fair notice. Then we went to Florida and told the seniors and the next generation what it's really going to take to fix Social Security. We went to Wall Street and told the Wall Street bankers to get their snout out of the trough because they got it in there as deep and as bad as anybody else, living off the government in many ways. Then we went to Washington, D.C., and we told the government employee unions, you can't get a better deal than the taxpayers. You can't get paid more and get better benefits than the people who are paying the bill. And all of these things and more are instrumental to getting this country financially back on track. We simply need to do it. We have a government that's spending $40,000 or so a second that it doesn't have. If you're here in this meeting for an hour today, they'll spend $144 million that they don't have. Every hour, every day, every week, every month, we are drowning in debt. We are drowning in deficit. They're taking in $2.2 trillion and they're spending $3.5 trillion or so. You can't run your family like that. You can't run your business like that, Brett. You can't run the pharmacy like that. You'd be out of business in a matter of weeks if you ran it like that. So we've got to get the government to live within its means. Everybody's going to say they're going to do that, but I had the fortitude in the most difficult of circumstances to actually do it. I had the first government shutdown in a 150-year history in my state. I set a record for vetoes as governor to make sure that the legislature towed the line and stayed within the line in terms of spending in tax matters. I took more money using executive authority out of the budget in Minnesota in my 8 years as governor than all the 142 years worth of governors combined. Those are the kinds of tough actions and strong leadership that we're going to need as a nation. It's not going to be based on speeches. It's not going to be based on entertainment. It's going to be based on whether somebody has their compass set, whether they have the experience and the strength and the fortitude and the record of results to actually get it done. Because the time for talking about it is over. The time for doing it is now. And then very lastly, we got to get this economy moving in the form of doing things that are going to promote job growth. We've got a president who thinks the answer is to grow government. The answer is to grow the private economy by shrinking government, making it more encouraging, more competitive, more a lighter load for businesses to do the things that they need to do to provide jobs. I gave a very lengthy speech on this at Barack Obama's former place of employment, the University of Chicago. The whole speech and all the details laid out there for you at timpawlenty.com. I hope you go check it out. This is not going to be easy, but the way forward is not complex. You know, if you look at this great nation, we are the greatest nation in the history of the world for a reason. And we don't have to wonder what are the things that we can do to keep this nation great. We can just look back at what made us successful to begin with. And you know, we're not the most successful country in the world because we're the biggest from population. We're not. We're only 300 and some million people. We're competing against places much larger than us. We're not the cheapest place, although we do need to be more competitive. So what is our, if we're not the biggest and we're not the cheapest, what's our secret? Why have we been so successful? It's because we're the freest. And we sometimes think our freedom can be taken away only by external forces. And that could happen, and we better be vigilant about that. But just what's happening actually is the government incrementally, sometimes unnoticeably, is each day pushing into our lives in ways that says, we're going to make it more expensive for you, we're going to make it more difficult for you, we're going to slow it down, we're going to regulate it, we're going to take it over, we're going to nudge you aside, we're going to say no thank you to you. And as government grows its footprints and government grows its budgets, that's not all they do. When they push into our lives to that extent and weigh us down to that extent, they begin to weigh down and discourage the American spirit. You got people saying, well, maybe individual responsibility isn't important. Maybe industriousness isn't important. Maybe the government will just do it all. Maybe the government will take it over. Or maybe the government's made it so expensive and so difficult from a regulatory standpoint, people just say it's not worth it. I see that around the country. That's not the America that I grew up in. I lived the American dream, as Mary mentioned, growing up in a meatpacking town under difficult circumstances. I know the American dream, I've lived it. That dream involves people who are hopeful and optimistic and have a can-do spirit and say individual responsibility matters and industriousness matters and having families together matters, having places of worship and recognizing and respecting that matters, making sure that we have an economy that's the private economy and providing jobs matters, not the government. So we can do this. It won't be easy. But if security were easy, everybody around the world would be secure. And if prosperity were easy, everybody around the world would be prosperous, but they're not. If freedom were easy, everybody around the world would be free, but they're not. And those of you who see this, those of you who know it, have to stand up with us now and stand up and fight and get this country back and get it back on the right path. We can do it. But it's going to take all of us working together. And the next step for that is the AIM straw poll, August 13th. It's coming up fast. And whoever catapults, whoever slingshots out of Iowa, is going to have a lot to say about the rest of this race. And I urge you to think about putting somebody in that position who is not just good for Iowa in that moment, but can actually be our nominee, has the requisite skills and experience and record to be the President of the United States and govern and lead in the most historic, challenging times in the modern history of the country. I'm that candidate, but I can't do it alone. Mary and I need you, so I hope if you're not already signed up on our website that you'll sign up, or you'll see one of the folks in the back of the room and fill out a card before you go. We can get you there, get you a ticket, make it easy for you. It'll be a fun day on Ames, but it'll be a huge boost to our effort for you to come and bring your friends, relatives, neighbors, and get them to come, because it's going to be a very, very important benchmark for the next phase of this campaign. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming this morning and taking time out of your busy day. Thank you for your service in the legislature and your kind introduction to Mary. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Everybody in the back is sick of standing. You have some seats up here. You can come on and take a load off. Yes, sir.
Where do you stand on state rights?
Yeah,
I like Arizona and some of that stuff down there. You know.
Yeah. I'm sick of the federal government trying to take over everything. And I'm one of the people who sued the federal government to have Obamacare declared unconstitutional. I'm part of the lawsuit in Florida, and what's called an amicus status. But nonetheless, the Constitution says those things not explicitly given to the federal government should be reserved to the states. And not since Ronald Reagan have we had a great debate in this country about what's the federal government supposed to be doing and what are they not supposed to be doing. And they have dramatically overreached, and that's one of the reasons that Obamacare is such a bad idea. You now have the federal government in Washington, D.C. ordering citizens to buy or good or a service or be fined or penalized. Now, since when does the federal government tell us what to do down to the level of what good or service we have to provide? We tell them what to do. So, sir, I'm a strong supporter of the 10th Amendment. I think the federal government has overreached. I think the courts have overreached in that regard. And we need to get back towards state rights big time. Yes?
How far would you be willing to cut the budget to even it out? I mean, would you go as far as this year saying, we don't raise the debt limit, we cut our budget so we live within it, and from not 10 years out, because they're always projecting 10 years of savings. What about this year?
Yeah. I've opposed the debt limit long ago and gave a pathway forward to how to avoid it, but you should know they already blew through it. They busted it in May.
Do we stop now?
No, what we need to do is we got to get this budget balanced. We're not going to do that overnight, but we need to get on a pathway to do it over the next handful of years or so. So the proposal that we put on the table, and then get at Pawlenty.com to get the details, does that. But it starts with this premise. First, you got to grow the economy. You can't just cut your way out of this. You also have to grow. We're growing right now at 1 or 2% a year. That's anemic. That's pathetic. It's one of the worst recoveries out of a recession in the history of the country, courtesy of Barack Obama. Remember when he said if you don't pass the stimulus bill, the unemployment rate could go as high as 8%? Then it went to 10%. And again, a government-centric approach. So we said, let's first of all have a positive economic growth target. We pegged it at 5%. Aggressive, yes. Bold, yes. But we need it to help lift out of this hole. Then we said, let's cut tax rates, corporate and individual. Let's do regulatory reform to make the regulations lighter, quicker, simpler, easier, faster, and sunset them so that they don't go on forever, and make them come back for an up or down vote before Congress before they go into effect. Have an energy policy that's pro-American energy instead of pro-Middle Eastern. That says let's get our energy, more of it from here, as a way to increase supply and bring down costs, including drilling in Anwar and going after natural gas, doing healthcare reform the right way, and much more. But as to the cuts, we also put on the table a very massive amount of cuts to get the budget back on to balance, and then some over the next 10 years or less. But we can't do it overnight, and so I support the cut, cap and balance approach that's talked about. Jim DeMint and others have signed on to it, and I support that approach as well. Long term, get a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, but that's going to take some time, but we need to do it. 2, peg our spending to a percent of GDP, so you can't just balance the budget by raising taxes. And in the short term, get real, meaningful, and significant cuts. Not some, fluffy amount of money that they might say is a fig leaf for moving in the right direction. They need to make it real, they need to make it significant, but we're not going to go from where we are now to a balanced budget overnight. It's going to take at least a handful of years. Yes?
So the Obama administration has recently proposed higher taxes on energy producers, but won't this kill jobs and raise fuel prices?
President Obama has proposed to eliminate some exemptions or credits for energy producers, particularly as it relates to oil. Again, he demagogues the issue. But again, I said we shouldn't just pick on subsidies for ethanol. We should look at all the subsidies. I think the way to do this is to lower the tax burdens on everybody and then clean out as many of the special deals, credits, deductions, and exemptions as possible. But you can't just say we're going to eliminate an exemption or credit like Obama wants to, because that's a tax increase and will add to the cost of energy in our country, and we don't want that, obviously. So what we need to do is reform where we lower the tax burdens overall on the industry and then clean out the special deals so the net effect isn't a tax increase, but you have a flatter, simpler, more pro-growth, pro-investment, less cronyistic tax rate. Yes, sir.
Dr. Charles Krauthammer had a column this weekend in which he made a proposal that Congress tried to pass I can't remember whether he said 500 million or 500 billion, it was a big number, but a relatively small debt increase, and at the same time take the equal number, relatively small, out of the budget so that it's a zero-sum game, which in his analysis would give us about 6 months of political breathing room in order to start to a more rational reduction of things. Does that make sense to your program, your way of thinking?
Well, I have some preferred other preferences first, and I'll just walk you through it. They always say, these politicians in Washington, we're going to make the tough choices someday. Pretty soon we're going to have to make the tough choices. One of these days, we're going to make the tough choices. Eventually we're going to get to the tough choices. And they never do. And so what I learned as governor of Minnesota is most politicians are like running water downhill. They'll go to the point of least resistance, so you got to give them some resistance. And that's why I had that government shutdown over tax and spending matters. That's why I set a record for vetoes. That's why I used executive unallotments at a historic level. Was it popular? No. But did it have to be done? Yes. So here's what I said in January or February. I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that said, don't buy into Obama's false choice between raising the debt ceiling and defaulting. Order the Treasury now to begin to sequence payments to the highest priority obligations first, so we stretch out the window of time to have the discussion. Because they always say, oh, how can we do entitlement reform or more Medicaid reform? We just don't have the time in the short window coming up on the deadline. Remember, the deadline originally was April or May, then it was June or July, now it's August, and they never have the time. We're running out of time. So I said, okay, sequence the payments to the debt to get at least 6, 8, 10, 12 months to buy the time so you can do the real reform. And they neglected to do that. They didn't. It's all right. Well, like a Democrat.
That's got to be worse than my guess.
But they always say they don't have the time. And by the way, every one of these ideas on reform has been think-papered, white-papered, seminared, researched to death. There aren't any really new ideas. They've all been on the shelf for 20 years. The issue isn't, do you know what the options are? have the willpower and the fortitude to do any of it? And the answer so far has been no. So by the time, for the reasons you're suggesting, which is what I proposed in January or February, they didn't do that. Now they got their back up against the wall. But the debt limit of the country is $14.3 trillion, and they, according to Geithner, he told me a couple of weeks ago that they already blew through it in May. Now they're managing the cash flow to allow it, so they already blew through it. But here's what I would hope they do. Don't raise the debt ceiling, but if they're going to raise it, do the things I mentioned earlier. Constitutional amendment to balance the budget, limit it to percent of GDP, and then real spending reform right now. And if all that fails, then what? But I hope that they stand strong and get that done. I don't like the McConnell approach where you give the president the authority and it's partial solution. But then there's this issue that you mentioned, which is, do you parcel it out, meter out a chunk at a time, a little more for a debt ceiling increase for a real reduction, make the president come back every month to negotiate on an incremental basis. I don't like that in terms of, it's not the ideal, but it's been proposed as not plan A, B, or C, but like plan D. I would hope that they could do to cut cap and balance. Yes?
I think some of the budget things are the high deficits due to the overreaching on the Commerce Clause.
Yeah, the federal government is out of control. It is out of control. If the Congress were in the private sector and they were doing what they were doing in the private sector, they'd be bankrupt and probably be indicted for a Ponzi scheme. I mean, it's that bad. $2.2 trillion of revenues coming in the door. 3.5 is what they spent last year. $1.5 trillion deficit in 1 year. Same or so this year, $1 trillion deficit as far as the eye can see. And it's this insatiable appetite that the federal government has to bring things into Washington, federalize it, do more, spend more, and it's out of control. And part of it is they don't have any limits on what they think their authority is or their boundaries is. It gets back to your point, sir. I believe on all of these issues, we have to put up guardrails on politicians. I don't believe anymore that sending people to Washington, D.C. and just hoping they do the right thing is going to work for us. Either party. We have to put some rules of the road up in the form of a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, spending limits, and limits on the federal government's authority. Yes?
One of our ex-senators, he replaced him, had a meeting in Nevada last year, and he said that we needed to find companies in Iowa that would put their roots down and stay here. And I said to him, we have a couple companies that had their roots down for a long time. Maytag was one of them. And the other one was Electrolux in Webster City, two large washing machine companies. And they're both gone. We had them here, but apparently our governor does not have the power to reduce their taxes enough to entice them to stay here. Probably because of the 39% tax that corporations have to pay. Now they're gone. How can they come back? These people were instrumental even in a lot of our wartime materials, whether it be Singer sewing machine or whomever, and now they're all made in China. How can we defend ourselves or our industrial complex, military complex?
I really experienced this. When I grew up in South St. Paul, back in the day they had these 6, 7-story tall Swift and Armor meatpacking plants surrounded by the world's largest stockyards. Dominated my whole town. If you didn't work there, you had relatives who worked there. If you didn't work there directly, people worked there indirectly. And as I was growing up as a young boy, they all shut down. Thousands of moms and dads laid off, out of work. My own dad lost his job for a while. Then my mom died when I was young, as Mary mentioned. And so I saw at a very young age the face of what it does to families, what it does to towns, what it can do to a community and broader to the state. And if you go ask people, what do you really value in life? What brings you passion? What matters to you at a heart and gut level? Mostly they'll talk about their faith and their family. Then they'll describe a series of other activities that describe their hopes and dreams. They will describe a hope that they might have health care insurance and can pay for it. Maybe get their kids through college and can pay for it. Maybe if they got a little extra money, they might want to finish the basement and remodel or something. But all of that requires a job. and people don't have access to a job, they don't have the money to take care of their families and to pursue their dream. So what I would do about it is this. You have to have an environment in this country where businesses want to start and grow. And when I travel this country every day, all day, 6 days a week, and talk to hundreds of business leaders, every size imaginable, every sector, every part of the country, they all say the same thing. You've got to get the government off my back. And some talk about the tax burdens being too high. Some talk about the regulations being too slow and too difficult and too expensive. Some talk about energy costs being too high. Some talk about healthcare costs being too high. Some talk about out-of-control union costs and the government tilting the play table in favor of the unions, and on down the list. The basic message is, when you become president, you've got to do things to lighten the load, not make it heavier. And then lastly, we got to make stuff in this country, and we got to have a leader and a president who is for free trade, but it's got to be fair trade. So I'm for free trade, but I'm not for being stupid. I've been to China a number of times. And I'll just give you the example of how this goes if you're in a business in China, want to do business in China in an area that's of strategic interest to their government. What's your name, sir? Carol. Carol. So Carol, let's pretend I'm the Chinese government. Carol wants to come to China with his business and sell to my 1.5 billion people in China. Carol, thanks for your interest in China. I really appreciate it. I understand you want to access our 1.5 billion Chinese consumers. That's great. Where's your Chinese plant going to be as a condition of being able to be here? Where do you build your plant? How much is it going to cost? How many Chinese are you going to employ? And by the way, do you have some technology? Because we'd like to see it. And in fact, as a condition of doing business here, I'd like you to meet your new Chinese technology partner. What's your name? Marge is your new technology partner. And as a condition of doing business in China, Marge is your new partner. And guess what? If Marge is competing against you 5 or 7 years down the road with your senior executive team and stole your intellectual property and your technology and is using it, too bad for you, because we don't enforce intellectual property laws here in China. And Marge, if you are able to do that 7 years down the road, good for you. Now imagine if we turned the tables on that discussion in the United States and we said, well, you want to come to America, huh? You want to access our affluent 300 plus million consumers here in America? Where's your American plant? How many Americans are you going to employ? How much is it going to cost to, which capital investment are you going to put into it? By the way, do you have some technology? Because we'd like to see it. I'd like to have you partner with your new American technology partner. Now that doesn't happen every time a business wants to go to China, but it happens a lot in areas of strategic interest to China. Now we wouldn't do that, but we've got to deal with China in a fair and strong manner. And it's hard to tell off your banker. One of the reasons we're not strong enough with China is because they buy our debt and they hold the paper on too much of our debt. We need to quit being a debtor nation and going around the world with our cup out, asking other countries to buy our debt to support our bad habits. We need to clean up our house, get our financial house in order so we can deal with China from a position of strength and other places from a position of strength as well. And that'll help in terms of our competitiveness, in terms of manufacturing and getting on a level playing field. But to answer your question, the bottom line is you got to make this a place where businesses want to start and grow. Our country is not competitive as it should be. Yes?
How do you stand on gun control?
I'm a strong believer in the Second Amendment. I believe the issue for guns is we should enforce the laws that we have, not create new ones or put new or additional burdens on the Second Amendment. I believe it says what it says. We have the right to keep and bear arms. It's not government's job or business or doesn't have the authority to impinge upon that in any significant manner. Yes?
Okay, I got 2 questions.
Thanks for being in my skit, by the way.
One question, I guess, what's your opinion on the right to work law getting out?
Yeah. I strongly support right-to-work laws. These are the laws that say if you want to work at a particular place, in some states they make you join a union. I don't think the government should force anybody to be a member of any organization against their will. And so I support right-to-work laws. We weren't able to get it passed in Minnesota, but I strongly support it.
Second, I guess, opinion of us protecting the world, fighting in Afghanistan, all this country, all this stuff. What's your feeling?
Yes.
Is that necessary here? Is
Sure.
Doing this, or is this has got to be a big burden on our budget? Sure. The cost here.
Yeah.
For all of
That's a good question. Carol's asking for those in the back about the commitment in Afghanistan and more broadly. The United States, in terms of a war supplemental, spends about $130 million for both Iraq and Afghanistan, billion, for both wars currently. As you know, we are winding down our commitment in Iraq. I've been to Iraq 5 times, including last summer. The heat was actually about like this. And we're going to have potentially 0 troops there by December unless they invite us to keep a residual force. And by the way, given how much we've put into Iraq, if they do ask us for a small residual force, I think we should grant that request temporarily. They don't yet have a operational air force. They don't have certain intelligence capacity. And I think it would be well served to keep a small force there to try to continue the success that Iraq has had. Afghanistan is more complicated, but the president, I supported his decision to surge the troops in Afghanistan, but I didn't like the fact that he at the same time announced the withdrawal date at the same time he announced the surge. Remember that? He said, by the way, we're going to surge the troops and we're going to withdraw the troops in a certain date a year from now, or a year and a half from now. Well, what does that tell to your enemy? When you're in Afghanistan and you're a shopkeeper or somebody who's got to each day decide, are you going to help the Americans or not, it's a very risky situation. And the other side gets to say, well, they're leaving pretty soon, and guess what? We're going to come knock on your door as soon as they're gone, and changes your behavior. Now, we can't stay there forever, and I'm not for nation building Afghanistan. If you've been there or studied it, you know it's a nation that is not going to have a centralized, Western-style government anytime soon, and it's got a lot of problems. But here's what I believe we should do. When I was last there, General Petraeus, who I think is the most effective, impactful general in the modern history of the country, from last summer, said we need about 2 years to get this thing stabilized, with the mission being, can we get the Afghan security forces trained up in quality and volume to a sufficient point where they can do most of the lifting after we leave. And he said we needed about 2 years from last summer. So if you look at what the president has now done, is he started the surge withdrawal essentially now. He's going to draw down that level over the course of the next year, coincidentally timed to the presidential election. Petraeus thought that was a little too early and a little too rapid. Mullen, General of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair, thought it was a little too early and a little too rapid. So I'm for drawing down the troops in Afghanistan, but we need to do it with the measurement being success with the mission I've just defined, not some political calendar. And very lastly, you also need to know it's partly about Pakistan, which is a whole other story, but we worry about Iran getting nuclear weapons. Well, Pakistan already has them. And if Pakistan were to backslide into a jihadist state and leave one or more of those nukes go free or go loose, or they were a jihadist state overall, and they became a direct threat to the Middle East or to us, we'd have a very dangerous situation in our hands. So it's not something to take lightly. But I think we need to stand strong. We need to reduce our budget. But as it relates to security, it's the #1 responsibility of the federal government. We should stay vigilant. Let's go to somebody who hasn't asked one yet. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So, one more, Paul? Okay. We'll close on this one. Go ahead.
The gal that's the head of the National Association for the Preservation of Social Security and Medicare got a letter from the beginning of the year saying that people think that we're going defunct and so forth. She states that there's enough money for Social Security for 3 decades yet. Okay? But like Obama's, wanting to cut the checks and all that kind of stuff and so forth, does he actually have the authority himself to say, okay, no more Social Security checks, since Social Security isn't actually run by the government, but it's sitting out there and they get their hands in it? How can they do that?
Well, it's complicated, but the short version is, they have obligations each month that they have to pay, and they have to have the cash to pay it. And normally if they don't, then they print more money in the basement and run up the debt, and that's why they have to raise the debt ceiling. So now in August, various obligations are coming due that they can't pay. They claim they can't pay unless they raise the debt ceiling. And the president, in my reading of the law, has the authority to sequence and prioritize payments in any manner that they feel is appropriate. And in my view, there's enough money to pay at least the outside obligations so we don't default, the military obligations and Social Security. He could choose to, if he wanted to not pay that, as I understand it, but I can't imagine he would want to do that, although he's threatening to do it, I think, to scare people. Again, politicizing the debate for his own political purposes. I do think on Social Security, I want to be frank with you and say, for anybody on the program currently or anywhere near eligibility, we want to keep it just like it is because we made a promise to people and we should keep it. But for the next generation, this guy right here, you know, people coming into the workforce, we're going to have to tell them now, but give them several decades of notice. We're going to raise the retirement age gradually over time for the next generation of workers. We're also going to have to change the system to say, for the annual cost of living benefit, if you're lower income or middle income, you'll still get it just as you do now. But if you're wealthy, you won't get the cost of living adjustment in the future. I'm sorry, I don't like having to say that, but if we're going to get this thing back to stability and solvency, we're going to have to make some changes like that. It won't affect anybody on the program now, it won't affect anybody near the program, but those are the kinds of changes we're going to have to make for the next group of folks coming in. Okay, I've got to be done. I want to thank you for coming today. I appreciate the time on a weekday, and I know your time is precious with lots of different tugs and pulls on things you could do. We're very grateful that you'd be interested in our campaign. We can and will win this, but we can't do it without your help. So I hope with the caucuses in February, but more immediately, the Ames Straw Poll, please sign in. We'll get you there, like I said, make it easy for you, make it fun, but we need your help and support. We hope we can get that vote at the Ames Straw Poll on August 13th. Thank you very much. Well, that's about what it is.